Hello, my name is Sorensen. Thanks for joining me on this A.S.M.R video. In this installment of my series about albums that I own and love, I'd like to focus on Surf's Up by the Beach Boys. Of course, Pet Sounds is their masterpiece and is one of the greatest albums ever written and recorded. But everything that can be said about its brilliance has been said. I'd rather talk about a flawed album that is inferior to Pet Sounds in every way, but is nevertheless still an album with moments of brilliance and astonishing beauty. Some of the tracks on Surf's Up are also perhaps the best examples of songwriting contributions from members of the group, other than Brian Wilson. It's hard to imagine, but just in case any of you don't know, the Beach Boys were a 60s group formed in California by brothers Brian, Carol, and Dennis Wilson, along with their cousin Mike Love and a friend called Al Jardine. Brian was the genius songwriter producer behind most of their music and their success, but he was an extremely fragile character with a troubled personality. He didn't cope well with the real and perceived pressures of leading his band to that success. His creativity was an obsession and an emotional release, but it also tortured him. After a few years of touring, Brian had a meltdown whilst flying with the band and declared that he could no longer cope with the constant travelling. He demanded to go home where he could focus on writing and recording records for the group and leave the others to go on the road and promote those records. To fill Brian's place on tour, the Beach Boys brought in a number of different musicians, including the singer Glenn Campbell, who did a stint. They eventually settled on Bruce Johnston, who remained as the sixth member of the band. In the studio, Brian worked on new material and developed his production techniques by using a group of top session musicians called the Wrecking Crew to realize the complex music in his head. When the Beach Boys came home from their tours, they would join him in the studio to record their signature vocal harmony parts over the recordings he had produced. After writing and producing his masterpiece, Pet Sounds, Brian spiraled out of control, heavily relying on drugs, putting on massive amounts of weight, and eventually shutting himself away from the world. His journey is one of the most fascinating and tragic in rock music history and has inspired numerous songs, books, films, and documentaries. Brian actually came out the other side of his psychosis to a certain extent and resumed touring his music in the early noughties with a new group of young musicians. By the time of recording Surf's Up in 1970-71, which was technically their 17th album, Brian was in a bad way, so his contributions were limited. His primary contribution to this album was writing the music for the final three songs, which incidentally and unsurprisingly are the standout tracks that make this an essential album for Beach Boys and Brian Wilson fans like me. This meant that other members of the band had to contribute material to fill out the album. It was a surprise to me that I also really liked most of these songs. This is the full track listing. 1. Don't Go Near the Water by Mike Love and Al Jardine. 2. Long Promised Road by Carol Wilson and Jack Riley. 3. Take a Load Off Your Feet, Al Jardine, Brian Wilson, Gary Winfrey. 4. Disney Girls by Bruce Johnson. 5. Student Demonstration Time by Jerry Lieber, Mike Stoller, and Mike Love. 6. Feel Flows by Carol Wilson and Jack Riley. 7. Looking at Tomorrow by Al Jardine and Gary Winfrey. 8. A Day in the Life of a Tree by Brian Wilson and Jack Riley. 9. Till I Die by Brian Wilson. 10. Surf's Up by Brian Wilson and Van Dyke Parks. Long Promised Road and Feel Flows were the first serious songwriting contributions that Carol Wilson made to the band. He more or less recorded all of the parts for these two songs himself, and they're a great addition to this album. In fact, Feel Flows is one of the songs that blew my mind when I heard the album for the first time, and I just assumed it was another track written by Brian. Don't Go Near the Water, Take a Load Off Your Feet, and Looking at Tomorrow are all good album tracks that were written or co-written by Al Jardine. Disney Girls, written by Bruce Johnson, has a beautiful melody and vocal harmonies, and was praised by Brian at the time. Surf's Up is the title track that Brian wrote with lyrics by Van Dyke Parks. It's a great experimental Beach Boys song that symbolises the end of an era for the band and was supposed to feature on their ill-fated Smile album from 3 years earlier. The two songs that precede it, also written by Brian, are my favourites on the album. They are both gorgeous, emotional songs with beautiful melodies and multi-layered vocal sections. A Day in the Life of a Tree and Till I Die. The only song on this album that I don't like, in fact I can't stand, is Student Demonstration Time, which is a Mike Love reworking of a Jerry Leiber Mike Stoller song. It makes no sense on this album and completely ruins the psychedelic ambience created by the previous 4 songs. It's whiny and bland and more abrasive than the songs around it, and the tempo is all wrong for that moment on the album. Because it has been thrown in as the 5th track, it spoils the album's natural progression towards the climax of Brian's beautiful songs at the end. I hate having to skip over songs when listening to an album, especially a good album, but I just can't listen to this song again. The first time I heard Surf's Up was in a tour bus when I was on the road with my old group, Dawn of the Replicants. Although I was already a huge fan of the Beach Boys, at that point I only owned Pet Sounds and a fairly comprehensive greatest hits compilation. The digital age hadn't quite kicked in, so it wasn't all that easy to get access to music in the way it is today. And nobody could really afford to buy everything they wanted when you consider that CDs were often £15 or £16 each. Before downloads and streaming, you really had to choose carefully when building up your music collection. There wasn't as much scope for speculating because throwing that much money away on an album that turned out to be rubbish could be quite depressing and infuriating. I still remember seeing the horror on my brother's face when he came home one day with a double album by Lou Reed that was called Metal Machine Music. When he played it only to realise that all 4 sides were literally filled with the sound of machine noise and feedback with no songs, he knew in that moment that he had been hustled out of his £25. He and I also learned in that moment not to just trust the name of a group or artist we liked when buying music. If a great songwriter like Lou Reed could end up subjecting his fan base to this self-indulgent nonsense and then con them into paying for it, then I suppose anyone could. Before hearing Surf's Up for the first time on that tour, I had assumed I already owned everything I needed to own by the Beach Boys, and no one had advised me that it was an essential album for my collection. Anyway, it turned out I was very wrong, and I did need to own it. We were travelling in an old tour van with a cassette machine hooked up to the speakers. So we all brought a selection of tapes to play as we travelled around the country. One of the tapes our lead singer brought had a sketchy, hissy version of the Surf's Up album on one side. I couldn't believe my luck when I heard it. I fell in love immediately, as this was Beach Boys material that I never knew existed. And a lot of it was really good. The last few songs, written by Brian, were absolutely beautiful. I have some kind of obsessive compulsive condition, especially when it comes to music. If I hear something I really like, I will play it over and over until I've gleaned everything I can from it. This might literally mean playing a song 15 or 20 times in succession until I've completely exorcised the insatiable need to hear it. I try to keep this aspect of my psychology behind closed doors, where I can indulge myself without the ridicule of others. Unfortunately, we were imprisoned in a tour bus together, and the others were not overly entertained by my persistent requests to play Surf's Up again and again and again. I could not get enough, and I also needed a better quality version of the album. So each town and city we stopped at, I would scour through any record shop I could find. It was actually very difficult to get my hands on a copy of the album. Nobody seemed to stock it. I couldn't find a CD copy anywhere. But I eventually found this vinyl copy in a record store in London. Playing it very loud on a turntable when I got back home to Scotland, after that tour was a joyous experience. I just want to say a wee bit about the album cover before I end this video. Because although it's a cool image, I always thought it was a pretty random choice for the Beach Boys to make. It turns out that this cover is based on a sculpture called End of the Trail by James Earl Fraser. The statue and album cover depicts a Native American man hanging limp as his horse comes to the edge of the Pacific Ocean. The original work is a commentary on the damage inflicted upon Native Americans by European settlements. The main figure embodies the suffering and exhaustion of people driven from their native lands. Thank you for making it to the end of this video. If you haven't already, then please subscribe to my channel and press the like button.